Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning into today's discussion regarding developments in North Korea's foreign policy. So my name is Natalia Slavny, and I am a research analyst and assistant editor for the 38 North program at the Henry L. Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. And today I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Rachel Min-Young Lee and Robert Carlin. Rachel is a senior fellow with the 38 North program. She served as a North Korea collection expert and analyst with open source enterprise in the US government for almost 20 years, writing on the gamut of North Korean issues, including leadership, domestic politics, the economy, foreign policy, and social developments. And she has a wealth of experience tracking and analyzing North and South Korean issues with implications for North Korea's regime stability and regional security. And Bob Carlin is a non-resident fellow with our 38 North program, as well as a non-resident scholar at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. Bob has been following North Korea since 1974 from both in and out of government and has taken part in countless hours of negotiations and unofficial discussions with North Korean officials. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. We're going to start with a short introduction, and Bob and Rachel will go on to their discussion points. And if you have questions at any time, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, and we will look them over during discussion. So Kim Jong Un's recent statements about South Korea and unification have once again raised some important questions about North Korea's foreign policies, as well as those specifically towards South Korea and what their ultimate goals seem to be. This is an interesting year as well, as it marks the 75th anniversary of forging the relationships between North Korea and China. And Russia's Vladimir Putin is expected to make a reciprocal visit to North Korea in the coming months. And that'll give Kim Jong Un ample opportunity to further strengthen ties with these neighboring states. Adding a layer of complexity is what appear to be some mixed signals from North Korea as it's shifting attention away from national defense to the economy. So today, Rachel and Bob are going to help us unpack North Korea's foreign policy strategy, its evolving approaches towards South Korea, and the role its foreign ministry website has played in signaling these major shifts, and how some external relations are likely to play out in the near to mid-future. So I'm going to hand it off to Rachel first, who will give us a review of what she and Bob have been up to in terms of their research and monitoring North Korea's foreign ministry website to help us figure out where North Korea's policies currently stand. So Rachel, please take it away.
Thank you, Natalia. Over the past 1 year, Bob and I conducted research on the North Korean Foreign Ministry website. The goal of the project was to gauge the website's role in Pyongyang's foreign policy, whether it reflected foreign policy in any meaningful way, or even if it functioned as a harbinger of change in foreign policy. What piqued our interest in the Foreign Ministry website were the changes we started to observe going back as far as the summer of 2019. Prior to that, the website was one of North Korea's many propaganda websites. It rarely hosted any unique content and was almost always regurgitating existing reports on Kim Jong Un's activities or North Korea's diplomatic exchanges. That started to change in mid-2019 when it started to carry articles from foreign ministry institutes that were not carried elsewhere. This was around the time the foreign ministry started to issue a flurry of statements attributed to individual foreign ministry officials like Choi Sun-hee. So it seems like the country was looking for ways to diversify foreign ministry vehicles and also to change the role of the ministry's website. A major turning point of the foreign ministry as a meaningful foreign policy platform was in August 2021, when the website started to endorse while reporting on a range of foreign policy issues. Prior to that, the website mentioned China and Russia while reporting on diplomatic, citing Chinese and Russian entities, Korea and the Kim leaders. So this was a key signal of Pyongyang's reorientation of foreign policy, and the website had in effect become a harbinger of North Korea's foreign policy change. Building on that move, over the next 1 year, North Korea lifted its moratorium on longer-range missiles and missile and nuclear testing and resumed ICBM launches, publicly gave full support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and revised the nuclear law that paved the way for preemptive nuclear strikes. And in addition, Kim Jong Un essentially shifted away from North Korea's 30 plus years of policy, which was a US policy that's centered on normalization of relations through denuclearization. One notable development on the website is that in July 2021, it started carrying more commentary type reports and articles on a broad range of international issues that one used to see on the international page of the Party Daily, Rodong Shinmun, until the Party Daily virtually ceased carrying commentaries in October 2019. In a way, the website appeared to have stepped in as the Party Daily's international page, which used to be a main avenue by which to gauge Pyongyang's stance on a variety of international and foreign policy issues. However, the Foreign Ministry website's role as a foreign policy platform has declined since last fall, when the Party Daily started to comment more on foreign policy issues. Going on to North Korea's domestic and foreign policy trends, post-Hanoi summit trends indicate that North Korea has made a longer-term strategic shift rather than a near-term tactical shift, meaning giving up on normalization of relations with the US through denuclearization, pivoting back to China and Russia, and giving up on peaceful unification with South Korea. This marks a fundamental shift in North Korea's 30-year foreign policy and the unification policy of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. Kim appears to have gained confidence by advancements in weapons development and economic management, and also the space created by a weakened US on the world stage, and also Putin's shattering of the global order. North Korea's economic reform or market-oriented measures appear to have slowed down. Kim may no longer be interested in reform for the time being, or it has decided it can make a version of economic reform work without improving relations with the US. And if the latter is true, that would mark a major shift from Pyongyang's decades-long belief that the US is essential for an improved economy. So all in all, the strategic value of the US appears to have decreased for Pyongyang. Speaking of the economy, one of North Korea's key themes these days is what it calls the 20 by 10 policy, the crux of which is to establish local industrial plants in 20 counties over 10 years with central government investment every year. The primary goal of the 2010 policy is to improve the civilian economy. However, it appears to be incongruous with the general trend of North Korea's foreign and South Korea policies and the signals North Korea has sent on defense industries. It thus remains to be seen how the 2010 policy fits into the North's foreign policy and economic policy. And I'll end it here for now, and I'd be happy to answer questions later on. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Rachel, for giving us that context and setting the scene for where North Korea's policies seem to stand. So now I'll hand it over to Bob to explain where he thinks North Korea is going. So Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Natalia. As usual, I don't have too much to add to what Minyoung had to say. She's really the strong foundation for a lot of my analysis. I would say that we were really lucky that the Foreign Ministry website was functioning as it was in the summer and early autumn of 2021, because it gave us the tip-off to the big changes that were coming. I don't know why it was allowed to do that. I don't know if that was an intentional or if we just happened to get lucky. The fact is, though, that was one of those instances in the life of analysis where you got a lucky break. Most of the time you don't. On the question of the possible new concentration by Kim Jong Un on the economy, as Min Young said, we really ought to be very cautious about that. The 2010 push, the new line, it's still not clear to me how deep that is, and I'll explain why that is. Since the beginning of the year, if you look at Kim Jong Un's appearances, they are overwhelmingly military. There are a few instances where he's gone to economic type events, but almost all of it is on military economy, munitions plants, and most recently, in the month of March, he spent almost all of his time with the Korean People's Army and in drills. In every single one of those, the focus is on war preparations. And they make a distinction between combat preparations and war preparations. Combat preparations was the norm when Kim went to KPA units in the past. They didn't talk about war preparations. People who think that this new emphasis on war preparations is just same old from the North Koreans, I think need to go back and recheck the files. So Kim's concentration is on the military. And when you look at the SPA meeting in January, you find that even though he spent a lot of time on the economy, and I'm going to real quickly point out a few, if I can read them, a few passages. This is not cherry picking. This seems to me to be really important to understand. Kim said, as preparations for a great event have become urgent reality, we have to be ready for ensuring powerful military action. What is a great event? The great event is the great revolutionary event, which was in the old days, and probably is again, the reunification of the peninsula by military force. Kim said that all citizens should regard national defense as the greatest patriotic work and turn out to it voluntarily. That's not quite the same thing as the 2010 policy. He said, the people's government organs at all levels should take thoroughgoing measures to immediately switch over to the wartime system in case of emergency and make full material preparations for all people resistance. Again, that's a little bit at odds with this 2010 policy, unless this 2010 policy is defined in a way that supports that instruction from Kim. The final thing we need to be looking at, I think, is the preparations the North Koreans are making, and Kim has pointed to for an upcoming clash with South Korea. In his SPA remarks, Kim talked about the need to redefine or to define the national boundaries of the DPRK. He specifically pointed to the West Sea. And he said at the next SPA meeting, we should discuss these things and maybe put it in writing in the Constitution. Well, we don't know when the next SPA meeting is going to be, but a normal sequence after a January SPA meeting would be to have one in September or October. That means that we have 3 months or 4 months of grace about before things really heat up. And it's not just at that SPA meeting that Kim has spoken about the West Sea and the need to prepare for action there. He attended a cruise missile launch think it was in January, at the end of January. He did it on the East Coast, and yet he had West Coast military officials there to observe it. Why? Because the cruise missile development is very, very important and dangerous to developments in the West Sea. So I think the focus continues to be by Kim on war preparations, that we have a possible clash in the West Sea coming up. I don't think, I've seen over and over again, I've seen observers and even the South Koreans talk about, well, the North Koreans might try to seize a West Sea island, as if that's something minor. That's an act of war. And if he defines the new boundary as including those West Sea islands and says they are now North Korean territory, you can bet that we're on the edge of a very big cliff, and he knows that. And my guess is he's ready for it, and he would even welcome it. He would love to see an overreaction by the South Koreans, I think. One last thing on Putin. I heard, I think several people probably have heard this, that Putin wasn't going to come before the election. Well, he had his election, that's done. He may have a few other things to do in March and April. But they were leaning so far forward, and so were the North Koreans, in talking about possible visit. My guess is we're going to see one, and my concern is we might see a new North Korea-Russia treaty. There was something in what Chasten he said after her visit about putting the relationship on a new legal basis. If that isn't a treaty, good for us. If it is a treaty, the concern ought to be how close is it going to be to their previous treaty, the 1961 treaty, which had clauses of mutual assistance, that is defense, a very heavy defense component to it. Because if that were to be in a North Korea-Russia treaty, it would, I think, profoundly change the situation in Northeast Asia. Okay, I'll stop there. And Caitlin, what do you no, who's talking here?
No, Bob, thank you.
Natalia,
Thanks so
okay.
much for that. Yeah.
Do you want to go to questions at this point?
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions coming in. So please, as I said, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to put them in the question and answer box. We're monitoring it, and I see a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to take moderator's privilege, if I may. So for the two of you, how significant is the portrayal of foreign policy on the Foreign Ministry website in shaping perceptions of North Korea and how it views foreign policy? We're in the midst of all of these different strategic alignments, changes in how they view unification with South Korea, scrubbing some other digital publications from the internet and some radio stations, for example. What value does the Foreign Ministry website hold for North Korea watchers and the international community? And do you think it will continue to have the same value in the role that it currently plays moving forward?
Natalia, thanks for that question. I think, as Bob mentioned, the value of the DPRK Foreign Ministry website was in the past, as far as I can see. As I mentioned towards the end of my presentation, the value of the DPRK Foreign Ministry website as a source by which we can gauge North Korea's position on a range of international and foreign policy issues has really gone down. The reason being that the unique content that I had referred to earlier, which is around mid-2019 is when they started carrying a lot of unique content, and it really peaked in 2021, 2022, 2023, we're not really seeing that anymore. And in fact, and this is something I mentioned again during my presentation, we're seeing the Party Daily, 노동신문, picking up more on international issues. So I do wonder if the role that the Foreign Ministry website was playing is being picked up by the Party Daily. So Bob, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I agree with that, except that, and as you pointed out to me the other day, the Foreign Ministry website carried a report on a Putin interview a couple of weeks ago in which he forthrightly spoke about the use of nuclear weapons. Previously, the North Korean had avoided picking up Putin's remarks on nuclear weapons. This is the first time they've done it. As far as I know, it's still not in central media. Is that right?
It's not. I don't think it's on any other North Korean website or
Yes.
any other North Korean newspaper. No, that's a good point. That article that we saw carried on the Foreign Ministry website yesterday, so the 26th. And I would say that's probably by far the most useful Foreign Ministry website piece we've seen in a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that report was that North Korea, in all of its pickups of Russian comment about the war in Ukraine, sort of, I guess, shied away from or avoided citing Putin and other Russian officials on the potential use of nuclear weapons. But for some reason, this article on the 26th cited Putin on the possible use of or being ready to use nuclear weapons. The other interesting thing about that article was that it seems to have been carried belatedly. I believe Putin's interview where he said Russia was ready to use nuclear weapons was carried on the 13th of March. So there was really a 13-day lag, which I would say is long for a North Korean source to pick up.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, both of you. More questions are piling in, so this is great. We've got a question for Rachel, specifically about the distinction between what Bob mentioned of combat preparations versus war preparations. Is that evident in the Korean or just in English? If it's different in both languages, does it match the language that South Korea might use for war readiness?
I'm not really sure how South Korea would characterize or distinguish the two terms, but yeah, in the vernacular, the two terms are different. War preparations would be 전쟁 준비, and combat would be 투쟁 준비. So 투쟁 and 전쟁, they're two different things.
Further on that question, is there any reason to think that North Korea might just be modernizing their language to match or mirror more common language that South Korea might use?
No, that's a good question. And we know that North Korea likes to modernize when it can, when it does make sense. But I would say in this particular case that may not be it, because they still do use those two terms. They separate out those two terms. I think it would make that argument or that question I guess that argument would make more sense if we're seeing one and not the other. But we're seeing both, so.
Okay, we have another question about tonality and vocabulary. We have a question, is there a difference in tonality or actual text between the KCNA in English of the specific January 16th speech versus what was published domestically in Korean?
I did not compare the English KCNA English version against the vernacular word for word. But I would say that in general, important speeches or Kim Jong Un speeches tend to be pretty faithful. They tend to be faithful translations, and that is not to say that everything is always accurate or that they they would translate words the way I would translate them necessarily. And in terms of any discrepancies we might see between KCNA English and the vernacular, I don't really have a good question when there are discrepancies, whether those are intentional discrepancies or whether there were translation errors. That's another research project.
We have a question. How do you see the enhanced North Korea-Russian cooperation as impacting China's foreign policy toward North Korea? It's open to both of you.
Well, so far, I think what we've seen is a shift to lackluster language on the part of the Chinese in talking about North Korea. The Chinese, the daily Chinese Foreign Ministry press conference rarely has anything about North Korea these days. It used to be much more regular. I don't think that's just because reporters are not raising the issue. The language that the Chinese use in responding, like when they just had the international department head there, it's not very well, that lacks a lot of warmth. Let me put it that way. The North Korean language tends to be warmer, although that too has lost a lot of its temperature. So I think simply based on that, we get the feeling that the Chinese are not terribly happy. That doesn't mean that they're opposed to this, and it doesn't mean that they feel as if they're going to pull the North Koreans away from the Russians. There are a lot of reasons why the Chinese might be perfectly happy to see that the North Korea-Russia relationship develop, as long as it doesn't go too far or go over the edge. It leaves the Chinese free to seem to be the good guy, even though the North Koreans are doing pretty much what they want them to do, which is to annoy the Americans.
Rachel, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with Bob's assessment. I think the North Korean handling of China certainly has cooled down since, I would say since September, around September of last year. We don't, in the higher level statements or specifically Kim Jong Un's letters to Xi Jinping, I think the language definitely, when you look at those, the language has definitely cooled off compared to his letters prior to September 2023. And I don't know if that has anything to do with China sending lower level delegations to the armistice agreement, the war victory parade back in July. And also the parade North Korea had in September to mark the DPRK's day founding. It's really hard to say, but given the timing in which we started to see the language cooling down, it may have something to do with the level of delegations. I think, a lot of people have questions about, where North Korea's relations with China and Russia will go from here on out. I mean, it's really hard to predict the future, but I think it is very important to think about that question from from North Korea's point of view and how North Korea sees the world, how it sees the global order, and where it sees China and Russia versus the US. And as I mentioned briefly in my presentation earlier, I do think that what North Korea sees is a significantly weakened US on the global stage. And, in contrast, what it sees is a more powerful China. And it also sees Russia, you know, again, shattering the existing global order. And pretty much nothing has really been done to stop Putin. Sure, there have been sanctions, but those really haven't had much impact, not the desired impact anyway. So when you're looking at all of this from Kim Jong Un's point of view, from where he's sitting in Pyongyang, I think he's asking the question of, why should we care so much about the US? And he has nuclear weapons, from his point of view. So do we need North Korea? Do we need the US for our regime security? Doesn't that make better sense to align with China and Russia? And, the other question that always inevitably comes up when we have this discussion about where North Korea is going to go with or might go with Beijing and Moscow and how far and for how long, I think the general assessment is that North Korea's relationships with China and Russia are transactional and will remain transactional. I don't think we should take that for granted. Again, because the global order is shifting, right? The world, it's changing. Things are changing. Things are not what they were back in the 1990s during the Cold War. So I think that's something I think we need to be receptive or open to the idea that the relationships may be more than transactional, even after the war in Ukraine is over. So, Bob, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
That's a lot to think about, Rachel.
I kind of threw everything out there, as in some ways
No, it's
preempting some
great.
questions about.
Seeing more questions come in right after you finish. This is great. Following the thread on Russia and North Korean relations, we have a question about if we've seen any clues from the Foreign Ministry website about what kind of assistance Russia might provide to North Korea, whether it's sensitive conventional weaponry or technology, or if it's still kept pretty vague, if we've seen any kind of signaling like that.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
No, just no. I'll pound my shoe on the table and say no, nothing.
I mean, the only signaling that we have seen on the North Korean Foreign Ministry website is that North Koreans are very supportive of the Russians right now. And I don't see any indication that that's going to stop anytime soon. So I don't know if then that can be a signal, I guess, of something deeper in the relationship. But yeah, specifically to the question of whether we might glean from the North Korean website reporting any Russian cooperation on the military front, no. And that is not a surprise either.
So we've got a couple of questions coming in related to the US. Rachel, you just mentioned that the strategic value of the US has decreased in North Korea's eyes. With that in mind, how significant do you think the US presidential election is or will be in that foreign policy calculus? Do you think they're already following the debates or candidates? Are they thinking about what a Biden administration continuation would look like or a different candidate? Where does that fall on their calculus?
I certainly do think that the North Koreans are following the U.S. major political events, including the presidential election, very closely. That said, I don't think that the presidential election outcome will have much impact on North Korea's strategy toward the U.S. I think that if Trump were to be elected, that may induce North Korea to make some adjustments to its tactics. But I think in the grand scheme of things, the strategy itself will not change, depending on the U.S. Presidential election. I think we should remind ourselves of the fact that the Hanoi summit had a huge impact on Kim Jong Un and his foreign policy decisions. After following the summit, at one point he said, and I think in fact he might have said this more than one time. This was at the December 29 party plenary meeting. So at the end of the year in which the Hanoi summit was held, right? Because the summit was held in February. So in December of that year, at a major party plenary meeting, he said, we have to be prepared for a long-term confrontation with the U.S. No matter who is the president, the U.S. is always going to find fault with us. He may not have used the word president, but he certainly did imply that no matter who's in power in the U.S. is always going to pick a fight. So I think that is in some ways key to understanding Kim Jong-un's mindset. And also the other thing to remember is that North Korea's 5-year defense development plan, which began in 2021 with the 8th Party Congress, that comes to an end at the end of 2025. So I am skeptical that North Korea is going to make any strategic changes to its U.S. policy before that comes to an end.
Yeah, Bob, go ahead.
Maybe a few points. First, I'd guess that Kim is hoping that Trump will win, because that means the United States will descend into chaos, and that hang on a second, and that the way will be clear for the North Koreans to do a little bit more what they want to do. They don't trust Trump. If they engage him, as Min-young says, it will be for entirely tactical reasons, because they figure that they can maneuver in such a way that they'll come out on top. The fact that Hanoi was such a big shock to the North Koreans, it also shocked them into recognizing that their long-term fear, and we used to hear this over and over again, the United States would never accept the DPRK as a legitimate entity, and that in fact it only wanted to see the DPRK disappear. They worked against that for 30 years. They kept trying to prove that was wrong. And I think that Hanoi simply proved to them that no, their worst fear was right. As Min-young said, Kim finally said it doesn't matter who's in power in the U.S. The U.S. is forever going to be in opposition to us, and therefore it's not just a long-term confrontation. I suspect it means a military confrontation, and that's what's so disturbing today.
Great, thanks for that. We've got a couple of questions related to some of the recent commentary from Kim Yo-jong about Japan. So given the recent outreach between the two countries, do you think the US, Japan, and South Korea will have a trilateral response? And if so, will they stay united and coordinated to seize these opportunities? Or is this kind of a short-lived communication that kind of runs counter to the narrative between the bloc that's forming between North Korea, China, and Russia? Rachel, do you want to go first, or?
I don't think that we're going to see a trilateral response to a potential DPRK Japan summit. And in fact, I think the latest statement from Kim Yo-jong kind of shoots down, at least for now, the possibility of any further contact or summit between the two countries. Although that is not to say that they're not going to talk again. But I think this was largely driven, in my opinion, and Bob may have a different opinion, or I'm sure he'll have more to say about this. I think North Korea wanted to seize the opportunity presented by very low approval ratings for Prime Minister Kishida. When Koizumi went to North Korea in September 2002, and after that, the abductions, some abductees returned, and his approval ratings went up by something like 20%, I think. And that probably has not been lost on North Korea. And I think in some ways North Korea wanted to see how far it could push the envelope and see if the Japanese might take the bait. So talks or summit with preconditions. So no more discussion about abductees and no discussion about North Korea's WMD programs.
Bob, anything to add?
Yeah, it helps to remember that this really started several years ago. As soon as Kishida came into power, I think he probably signaled to the North Koreans, and they responded immediately on the Foreign Ministry website. Incidentally, that's another one of the upsides of following this site in those years. The Foreign Ministry website made it clear that the North Koreans were interested in hearing what Kishida had to say. That went all the way up to a Foreign Ministry official statement in 2022, I think, sort of confirming that there was a dialogue going on. Because we don't know the details of the dialogue and what was said, it's hard to fit in the public commentary because we're only hearing part of the telephone conversation here. But Kishida was clearly interested. He sustained it. He apparently in public said some very forward-leaning things that didn't get into the press that we noticed, but the North Koreans picked up. When Kim issued a condolence message to the Japanese foreign minister in January after the earthquake in Japan, that was a big sign. That was not unimportant. And to me, it suggested that the North Koreans were really prepared to move ahead. And then the bubble just collapsed for whatever reason. And whether it's the North Korean side or the Japanese side, I couldn't say. I read Kim Yo-jong's statements as maneuvers. I don't think they're the final word. And now it's up to the Japanese to decide whether they want to pull the pieces together again. I think that the North Korean view of the value of this thing has shifted over the last 2 years. In 2021, they had a very different view of what they could accomplish. Now, if they manage to do that, it really is going to cause troubles between South Korea and Japan. And that would delight Pyongyang, I think.
Great, thanks for that. Let's see, got some questions about the 20x10 policy specifically. The Korean People's Army has been assigned to support construction projects under this policy. How does this relate to the other priorities of the KPA? Either of you want to take a shot at that?
Well, just one thing, the KPA as a whole has not been assigned. Units or battalions in each KPA unit apparently have been pulled off to support the 2010. It's called the 124th Brigades or whatever. But when you look at the Kim's appearances at these military drills, he doesn't say anything about supporting the KPA's job of supporting economic reconstruction, anything like that. So there's, in my mind, until we find how these things fit together, there's a tension here. And it's hard to tell which one is on top. Although given Kim's appearances and emphasis, it really looks to me as if the military component of this is still the top priority, and the economic construction fits, but isn't supposed to pull away from national defense efforts.
And I have to agree with that assessment as well. Again, I think the primary goal of the 2010 policy is to improve the people's livelihoods, but I think the secondary goal of that policy is to feed into the defense industry. You know, when you look at where North Korea's foreign policy is going, when you look at all of Kim Jong Un's emphasis on the munitions industry supporting the defense industry, when you think about Kim Jong Un's unusual use of the terminology national defense economic work, I cannot fathom how we are looking at a civilian industries-led economy. It just doesn't seem to jive with what we're seeing, you know, in terms of the overall trend of where North Korea is going.
Great, thanks for both of your insight on that. Got a couple of questions related to some sanctions. So given that maybe North Korea doesn't view the US as influential as it used to, is there a future where sanctions can play a role in dictating North Korea's foreign policy? Do you see that as more of a positive or a negative?
I personally don't see how sanctions will figure much into North Korea's foreign policy, especially after the war in Ukraine, and you know, how really sanctions have just not have not worked on Russia, and I think that they've had limited impact on North Korea. And so unless China and Russia cooperate to achieve what we call maximum pressure on North Korea, I don't see how the sanctions will work. Bob, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
Great, okay. We got a couple of questions specifically about war preparation. If North Korea were to wage some kind of war, what would be his ultimate objective? Would it be specifically against the US or South Korea, or both of them as a united front? What do you think his thought process would be on that? What would his goals be? And further, is there a Chinese interest for war on the Korean Peninsula, or would they prefer the status quo?
It's obviously one of the key questions. It comes up a lot, and my answer is always the same, which is I don't know. Kim hasn't shown his hand on that. He certainly has been explicit about the possibility of retaking, absorbing the southern half of the peninsula back into the Republic. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean that really is his goal, but it doesn't mean that it's not his goal. We just have to pay attention to that. More importantly, if he's really concerned about the Americans, he wants to somehow take advantage of the U.S. being on its back foot, the U.S. being in retreat, and somehow facilitating that rearward movement by the Americans. I can't go beyond that. I don't know. We haven't seen enough. Maybe as we see more weapons come out, we'll get a better sense of what he has in mind.
Anything to add on that, Rachel? So someone is asking, how do the recent changes in North Korea's diplomatic relations, or its ramping up with certain actors in the region, show how the regime is trying to maybe reassert some state control as well as asserting its influence in the region? It's a bigger question, but if either of you have any kind of comments about where you see that strategy going or how it's being implemented.
I don't think North Korea has ambitions for regional influence. That may yet develop, but it seems to me that they're very narrowly focused on the peninsula. They don't want the region impinging on them, but I don't think I've ever seen things suggesting they want to really play a role in the region per se. Min-young, what do you think?
I'm not really seeing any indications of that either. You'll see North Korean propaganda language like, oh, we're a great power, we're rubbing shoulders with, great powers like the US, China, Russia. But that is not to say that they have any regional ambitions. I do think that they want to be a player. I think that they want to be an actor, but I think they want to be relevant. I think that where possible, with the exception of Americans and South Koreans, they're open to engaging, as we have seen from Kim Yo-jong's statements about a possible summit with Japan, or North Korea wanting to have talks with the EU. But yeah, beyond that, I don't really see any ambitions to become a regional power.
So when North Korea amended its constitution and started asserting itself as a nuclear armed state, do you think that sent a signal in that direction, or is that different?
Bob, what do you think?
This would be a big change for the North Koreans. When Kim Il-sung was around, he personified gravitas. He could go abroad and sort of assert some sort of North Korean presence. So far, Kim Jong Un hasn't done that. Whether he could ever do that, we'll have to see. I'm doubtful. Just in my experience, the North Koreans are much like the South Koreans used to be, and in many ways still are. They're very narrowly focused on their immediate neighborhood, especially on the peninsula. What we're seeing from the South Koreans these days is very unusual, and I think leaning too far forward on their skis. And the Americans are encouraging them to do that. Whether they can sustain it, well, we'll have to see.
Great. We have a question about kind of going off of what Rachel, you mentioned with some maybe diplomatic engagement opportunities with other countries. Now that Julie Turner has been appointed, and the Biden administration is arguably signaling that they're still ready to meet anytime, anywhere, do you see any opportunities based on recent events or comments that there could be a window of opportunity for building stronger relations with the US, potentially Europe or other countries in the West?
With the US, I don't think so for the foreseeable future. I think, and I have heard that North Korea is interested in engaging with the European Union, but I don't think that recent US government officials' comments about interim steps will impact North Korea's US policy. But Bob, maybe you have different thoughts on that.
I think this feint towards the EU is dreamland. The EU is not going to respond positively in any way, shape, or form to the North Koreans, period. I think the North Koreans know that, but there's somebody in Pyongyang who keeps hoping that they can make a dent. And so that's what we'll see over the next several months, I bet.
We got a question talking about several Western embassies and the UN exploring a potential reopening in the country and more in-country presence, as well as North Korea visiting Mongolia, Vietnam, and Laos. What would be the foreign policy implications and objectives with those kinds of relationship building?
I think that North Korea, so Kim Jong Un has said, and as recently as in his speech at the party plenary meeting in 2023, just at the end of 2023, that North Korea should step up cooperation with anti-imperialist and anti-US countries. So I think North Korea's foreign policy priority will remain close cooperation with like-minded countries like China and Russia. And I think if you look at the North Korean party delegations' visits to China, Vietnam, and I guess Laos, those are countries with which North Korea has had party-to-party, communist, party-to-party relationships. So I think we should see his ongoing visits to those countries in that vein of cooperating with anti-imperialist, anti-US countries. Bob, did you have anything to add?
No, I know a lot of people were at first excited by the opening of the embassies. It seems to me that that's just returning to normal. And the big thing is going to be if all of those embassies open up again, and if they all have the sorts of access they used to have to their own supply chains, etc. So we'll just have to watch to see how this continues over the next several months.
Okay, and we're winding down with timing. I think I will give you to the last question. What are any trends or developments that you think North Korea watchers should be looking for in the future regarding North Korea's foreign policy stances? And are there any particular spaces that we should watch or signals that we should look for?
Bob?
Well, that SPA meeting coming up, it seems to me, is going to be a major, major signal. And it could be disastrous, or Kim could decide he's going to tap on the brakes a little bit and not go quite so far yet. So to me, that's going to be a very illustrative moment. And that's what I'm watching for.
No, that's a good point. And because it was Kim Jong-il ordered, the addition of language on North Korean territory in the Constitution, and that's probably, I would be very surprised if we didn't see that in the next SPA, which likely will be in September. Because we just had one in January, I don't think we're going to have one in April. So I think that is going to be the big one. I agree with Bob on that.
Great. Okay, so we're right at 4, so we're going to end here, but I want to thank both Rachel and Bob for giving us their time today and their expertise, looking into an issue that's not the easiest to study. Bob always talks about reading the tea leaves, so I think we're really grateful to have both of you as experts to kind of walk us through what we should be looking for and what's important. I also want to thank the Stimson Center for hosting this event. And for those still interested in Korea Peninsula issues, please keep watching this space. 38 North is going to be hosting some more public events in the future, and we hope to see you all there as well. So thanks and have